Okay, so this is the second screencast about this example essay. This is the one where I'm going to talk about the content. So please, 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 a million times, please read the story that this essay is about. I shall do thee mischief in the woods. Um, and then read this example essay really carefully. I recommend reading it all the way through and just to see what it's like, and then go back and read all these little annotations. So here's what I do in this essay. So the essay is structured in a very logical, linear manner. If you're paying attention to the course content, that's a very typically male way to structure the essay. There's a lot of little joke there. There's a lot of different ways to structure essays, but this one is one that I think will serve you no matter what you're doing. So it just proceeds in a very logical manner. So in the introduction, you got to do several different things. The first thing is introduce basically what you're writing about. So you're writing about a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. So this first sentence here is just about what those stories are kind of about in terms of gender roles. So we have wolf as metaphor for a predatory male, hungry to spoil young women standing in society, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another line about gender roles. This introduces the gender role thing. Red as vulnerable object of desire, I say, is at the core of all Red Riding Hood tales. Then we switch. So we just spend a couple of sentences setting up the fact that it's a Red Riding Hood tale and the fact that it's going to deal with gender roles. Then we move into the focus of the essay, this modern retelling. I introduce the author, I introduce the story, and then I talk about basically what it does. It flips the script and presents Red as an uncivilized young woman and an unsavory businessman named Jude as the wolf. This line could be considered part of the thesis statement. In fact, this whole introduction moves pretty seamlessly to the thesis statement. However, here is the thesis statement. I'm going to talk a little bit about thesis statements, and I could probably post something on this as well. So, the way I think about thesis statements is the best thesis statements have three parts. Um, if you took English at DVC, you might hear it called a three-level thesis. It's a little bit different than a three-part thesis that you heard about in high school. But a three-level thesis, the way we think about it here in DVC English, is part number one is an observation. You might hear this being called a fact. Um, you might think about it too as something you notice. So the noticing here, or the observation, is that the story ends in a violent power shift. That's a fact. If you read the story, you know that the roles are reversed and the guy gets killed by the women. Spoiler alert, right? But that's just a fact. The next part is, what do I think about that fact? What's my opinion? What's my explanation? Um, well, that power shift reverses the traditional gendered structure of the tale. Notice that even having said that, and it's relatively simple, you know that I have to explain that later. So that's a part of my essay too. So I observe the story ends in this way, my opinion is this way. I also want you to notice that when I write something like the story reverses the traditional gendered structure of the tale, I have to explain the traditional gendered structure of the tale, and then I have to explain how this tale is different. So that's all observation plus opinion. That's all noticing plus explanation. The third part of the thesis statement, again, we have one observation, two opinion. Three is going to be significance, in which I talk about what's important about all of this. So my significance here is, in spite of the story's feminist recalibration, the ending remains problematic because the females have not escaped or changed the gendered paradigm, but rather appropriated the male aggressor, the male role of aggressor. That sounds complicated, right? But what I'm saying there is what I see in the story is essentially through most of the story, the man is on top, if you will. The man has more power and he's pursuing Red and he's trying to make a victim out of her. In the end of the story, those roles flip and Red and her grandmother end up making a victim out of the male. That's all well and good. It solves some problems, but it doesn't solve the problem that the inequality between the two genders is solved by is solved by violence or plays out in violence. So that's the significance to me, and hopefully that makes a little bit of sense with the essay assignment sheet. Basically, what I'm saying there is it's great that women aren't victimized, but someone is still being victimized. Like, we need to find a way out of this system. So that's kind of what I argue. So then I proceed in making my literary argument. So notice we have to establish traditional gender roles, talk about how they change, and then talk about why that is all important. So this first header establishes what Red's gender role is like. In this story, she one of the most important things that she does is she follows the traditional female gender trait of being vulnerable. Here I write that she's like a bird, and there's a quote. And then I explain that. My explanation is this calls to mind the classic feminine association of birds. So this Red is very different. She's beautiful, but it's hidden under an uncivilized exterior, and she's vulnerable because she kind of lives outside of society. Then I explain how she lives outside of society. Here I explain how her exterior is uncivilized. And so here I present a list of details about how Red is not traditionally beautiful, but she looks uncivilized, which I argue again makes her more vulnerable. I continue this and say that she's in the moment of being sexually mature, like she's a young woman. We think she's 16, 17, 18. There's graphic details in the description here. But she still wears braids and bow like a younger girl. And so then this is a transition. It is this combination of aspects that attracts the story's wolf. This is exactly the same as the original Red Riding stories. Red being young, beautiful, and vulnerable is what attracts the wolf. So in this story, this guy Jude is the wolf, and here's where I start talking about him. Here's where I talk about what makes him a wolf. He drinks and hires prostitutes. Okay, so he's a lecher, and he's a guy who's happy to use women as objects just for sex. I contrast him here with the woodsman, and I contrast him here with princes from different fairy tales. I say that these heroes, like those two, are moral men, moral male figures, whereas Jude treats women like meat. That's it. I move that quickly towards setting things up, and then I jump right in to talking about what happens in the story. So basically what happens in the story, as you know, because you definitely 100% have read it at this point, is the wolf kind of sets his sights. He targets Red and starts pursuing her. And so as he pursues her, he reveals more about himself, and she reveals more about herself. So I kind of bounce through the story and pick and choose these moments where I see Jude acting as a wolf and Red acting like Red. Essentially, through all of these moments, he's exerting his power and he's sexualizing her. And his behavior gets worse and worse. And so I talk about the pursuit escalating. So the pursuit starts, it gets worse, he gets more bold, he victimizes her more, and it continues all the way through the end of the story where Red leads him out to the woods where her grandmother is. And so here, once I'm done explaining kind of the plot movement of the story, then I switch into commentary. And this is where I begin to set up the significance portion of my essay. So here's where I explain the reversal of traditional gender roles. Here's a long topic sentence here. So remember, this word reversal, that is back in my thesis statement, right? Reversal. So basically what I did in the beginning of the story is I talked about this. Perhaps that should be underlined as part of the thesis. But I set up Red as vulnerable. I set up Jude as unsavory. And then I explain what happens in the story while both of those threads are kind of developing. Down here in the commentary, I talk about how that role reversal works. I spend a couple of paragraphs doing that. Then I switch to the significant. So I talk about how the story ends and how it makes sense to me. And then I talk about how that is problematic. So I think I explained this when I was talking through the assignment sheet, but coming up with the significance for a literary reading is tricky. With these stories, with this unit and the next unit, when we're talking about these fairy tales, I think it's really useful to look at how power works in the story and to think of it as like a sliding scale. On the assignment sheet, I use left and right, but you could also consider the power to be like a meter that goes up and down. So if you view power as a bar graph, um, like we have the wolf, and like you could make his color like, I don't know, we could stick with gender roles, right? You can make his color blue, right? Or even light blue for like a nice little boy. So at the beginning of the story, if you have a line at 0 at the bottom and 10 at the top, the wolf has all this power. The wolf kind of starts, the blue bar would be full up to like the number 8 or even the number 10, if you will. And the power that red has in the world, the pink bar, would be down very low. So the way that I see power work in this story is it kind of continues that way through the whole story. And in fact, the wolf gets more authoritative, right? And like imposes himself more on the young girl throughout the story until like he's planning on taking her inside of grandma's house and doing something to her. Probably not murder, but probably rape. And at that moment, the story switches and it becomes clear that these two women don't live in society, that they have power themselves. And the man, Jude, ends up getting devoured himself or killed at the end of the story. Story doesn't have all of that in it, but it's pretty clear what's going to happen. So if you're viewing those power meters, you know, where the blue bar for Jude was at 10 and the pink bar for red was at 1, at the end of the story, they completely switch and the pink bar goes all the way up to full and the blue bar goes all the way down to 0. Getting murdered is pretty much having your power reduced to 0, or murdering someone is increasing your power to 10, right? That's pretty much the most you can objectify a person, and the least you could respect their individuality would be to take everything that they have away from them by killing them. So those two meters totally flip flop. And so in my conclusion here, I spend time talking about how that's all well and good, and it's satisfying, and it makes a good story, but it's still really problematic because someone still has to die. And I get that we're in a fairy tale kind of morality, but most feminist theorists would not advocate women gaining power at the expense of men or anybody else. They would advocate the system changing in some way, where instead of this kind of binary system where one gender inherently has more power over another, they would advocate like doing away with the whole system um, in a way that wouldn't mean that anyone would have to have power asserted over anyone else because of their gender. So that's my example paper. I hope that that was helpful, and I'll see you on the discussion boards and elsewhere.